the longer this fighting goes on, uh, the more difficult it may be to find off ramps, the more potential for broader conflict. How dangerous is this for the rest of the world?
There's a real chance that there's an escalation here because not only do you have Hamas, but possibly Hezbollah to the north. We know that both of those organizations are primarily funded from Iran, and we don't know whether they are trying to draw the U.S. somehow in or expand this fight to make a bigger statement. So it's incredibly dangerous. And then you add the complexity of hostages, both Israelis and Americans. And so fighting street to street in Gaza will be a different kind of fight than we've ever seen before.
It's also reignited the debate about life in Gaza for the Palestinian people, although Gaza's been under Hamas control for more than a decade now. Is this a tipping point in that debate, especially given the public pushback against student groups at U.S. universities who have come out in support of Hamas, or at least in support of, or try to blame Israel?
Yeah. Those groups have said Israel is solely to blame for these attacks. And you can't watch the images from the ground. You can't hear the stories of the families that have been torn apart or the hostages taken from families and say this is somehow morally equivalent. You can't because, it's not soldier to soldier. It is terrorist to baby, terrorist to family, civilian. So I think that that's the danger that we're in. The fact that there is this effort to be morally equivalent now, just wait until the real push against Hamas inside Gaza happens. We're going to see a lot more of that.
How we got here and U.S. policies in particular are being discussed on the campaign trail. A White House spokesperson pounced on Republican National Committee Chair Ronna McDaniel for calling it a good opportunity to contrast with Biden administration policies. Is this challenging but necessary territory for the candidates to go into?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, listen, you can't. It's tough to say the depravity and what we're seeing on the ground is a good opportunity. That's what they jumped on. And so, that phrasing probably could have been done better, but contrast in how you're going to handle something, contrast in how you're going to treat Iran, contrast in, funding of Iran or stepping up and actually enforcing the sanctions on Iran. Those are all big red lines for Republicans. And I think they do see a political opportunity to make those contrasts public. In the moment when we're dealing with all that we're seeing on the ground, it's tough to hear some of that, and that's why the Democrats jumped on it.
There certainly is a lot of ground to cover there, though, from a policy standpoint. We have at least one third-party candidate now in the presidential race after Robert F. Kennedy Jr. abandoned his Democratic run for president. Lots of analysis will be ongoing about who he could hurt more in a potential Trump-Biden rematch by running as an independent. He says he's in it to win it, though. If the country is ready for an alternative, is it him, possibly?
Listen, he has some support, and you looked at the early Democratic polls where he was up to 20% or so. I mean, that's significant, and it just shows you the weakness, perhaps, of President Biden and Vice President Harris. Uh, I find it tough to believe that Robert Kennedy Jr. as an independent is going to somehow shoot the gap. It seems like he would take from one or the other party. Remember, you have other people in there too. Cornel West, for example, is another candidate who's going to run and draw away, one would think, from the Biden pot. I think there are so many iterations yet to come in this election that we just don't know what it's going to look like. And that's why it makes it so fascinating on both sides.
Just to take a step back for a minute and what you do as a journalist, whether it's covering the 2024 race or covering the atrocities happening in Israel, is it harder than it used to be to be able to kind of remain, a neutral presenter for the American people in some way, just because of the way the political climate has become more polarized than it ever was?
Yeah. On the politics side, I don't see it that way. I mean, I think I can get to a place where I have my personal thoughts, but I take them aside and I cover it like this side is this side is that. You make the decision how you feel. On the Israeli situation, that is a lot more difficult because there is, as I mentioned, no moral equivalency to what we're seeing, the depravity on the ground. And so to cover that fully, you have to acknowledge that and not say, here's how many Hamas terrorists are dead. Here's how many babies are dead, and somehow see that all as one. There are many, many big picture items that are going to be talked about how that goes forward. But right now, Israel is in an existential fight to take out Hamas completely.
The Republican and Democratic parties accuse each other of being parties of chaos and failure at this point on some level on various issues. How much does the recent disruption in the House of Representatives hurt Republicans potentially by feeding that narrative for Democrats?
Yeah, if it continued and it dragged on and it was really a long process, I think they would have a lot to hit on and run on of chaos. If Republicans get their house in order, no pun intended, by the end of the week, I think there's a long time before the election that it probably doesn't factor in, and they get a speaker and move on. But it is, disunity. And if you can't run the House, you're going to make that for your opponent a big political issue.
Your brand new book, To Rescue the Constitution, George Washington and the Fragile American Experiment, is dedicated. You dedicate it to all who seek common ground in the unifying principles in this book that have made our country great from the beginning. And you spend a lot of time delving into a time of great division in our country, even though we had just won the right to become our own country. Did it just feel like the right book and the right message at the right time?
It did. It actually became the right time even more as I've finished the book. And I write about that, about the partisanship that we see across the board, but we don't really remember how dark the days were in a couple of times. Our last book was about Ulysses S. Grant holding the country together, preventing it from going to a second civil war in 1876. But this is a time before that where we win the troops, Union troops, the Revolutionary Guard troops, win the battle against the British. Start that over. The forces under George Washington win the battle and the war against the British, but there is such a disunity. There's such dissent among the different colonies that they're loosely held together by what's called the Articles of Confederation. But the battles are so intense that some people say, you know what, it's just better to go back to British rule. And that's the place you go to and say, we have been very dark places where we almost didn't form as a country. That moment of the Constitutional Convention and George Washington leading that moment, I think needed to be, a soda straw look at the formation of our country and how important that was.
You spend some significant time on George Washington's life as well, giving a fuller picture of the man who would become such an iconic leader. Important to lay the groundwork for the rest of the book by doing that. But did you also feel the timing was important for our society today to revisit Washington and his place in history?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of things we can learn from Washington. One, that he always stepped up, he always served. He was tapped for a number of different things to be the commander of forces, to be the head of the Constitutional Convention, and then obviously to be the first American president. He is this figure that is, almost mythology, it's almost mythological that, we lift him up as godlike. He was a normal person, and he was actually very humble and said, I might not be the best for this job each time he went into the job. But he was a force that was provided gravitas to every room he walked in. And sometimes he was silent, he didn't weigh in, but his leadership kind of exuded throughout the Constitutional Convention and then in the first American presidency. Remember, there was no note in the desk for him. Nobody was telling him what it was going to be. There was no torch that was passed. He was the torch. And I think for that reason, looking at him and leadership, hopefully this narrative inspires other people to maybe be George Washington of the future. We could use a George Washington now and then.
The Constitution is so revered today. Um, it's hard to imagine it being so divisive right out of the gate, but it also still generates heated debate centuries later. So, after immersing yourself in Washington's life and the original constitutional controversy, if you will, what did you learn that you're hoping others will also see?
That dissent is baked in the cake in our government, that we should welcome dissent. We shouldn't be afraid of it. And that comes also to union, and balancing dissent and getting together and finding common ground is where we should be focused. I think the message from George Washington is that we as a country can fight through a lot, even in the darkest days. And if they can found the country and come up with this document that provides liberty, the single greatest legal document of any country in the world, and has held the test of time, despite being under attack from various sides, as you mentioned, I think it shows us that we are able to do a lot of things, and we should have hope for the future of our country.
Congratulations on your sixth book. I know
Yes,
it's
thank
number
you.
six. Fox's Bret Baier, chief political anchor, host of Special Report, also host of the Bret Baier podcast,
Yes,
and now author of To Rescue the Constitution. Thank you so much for your time.
thank you.